What happens to the human mind when it spends months staring at decomposing bodies while rats the size of cats feast on the flesh of former comrades? By November 1916, military physicians across the Western Front were documenting a disturbing phenomenon that would challenge every assumption about courage, cowardice, and the limits of human endurance. The Somme offensive had been grinding forward for 4 relentless months, transforming a once pastoral region of northern France into a moonscape of shell craters, barbed wire, and human remains. Along a front stretching from the North Sea to the Swiss border, approximately 2 million soldiers occupied a network of trenches that had calcified into permanent installations. These were not mere temporary defensive positions, but underground cities, complete with communication tunnels, command posts, medical stations, and supply depots carved into the chalk and clay of Western Europe. The trench systems of 1916 represented the culmination of 2 years of military engineering evolution. The British Expeditionary Force had learned, through catastrophic trial and error, that trenches needed to be at least 7 feet deep to provide adequate protection from rifle fire, with firing steps 18 inches high to allow soldiers to observe and shoot over the parapet. Behind the front-line trench, a second support trench provided fallback positions connected by communication trenches that zigged and zagged to prevent enemy machine gun fire from enfilading entire sections if breached. French military engineers had developed their own specifications: trenches 8 feet deep with concrete reinforcement where materials permitted, elaborate systems of dugouts extending 30 feet underground in some sectors. German forces, having occupied the most advantageous terrain early in the war, constructed the most sophisticated positions, complete with reinforced concrete bunkers, electric lighting powered by generators, and multiple defensive lines extending back several miles from the front. Between these opposing trench networks lay no man's land, varying in width from 50 yards to half a mile depending on the sector. This wasteland contained the detritus of 2 years of warfare: rusted barbed wire in coils and barriers, unexploded artillery shells, abandoned equipment, and thousands of unburied corpses. Military regulations mandated burial of the dead within 24 hours of death, but continuous enemy observation and machine gun fire rendered recovery operations impossible in most sectors during daylight hours. The soldiers occupying these positions in November 1916 represented a cross-section of European society. British forces included factory workers from Manchester, farmers from Yorkshire, clerks from London, and university students who had enlisted with enthusiasm in 1914. French regiments contained peasants from Normandy, winemakers from Burgundy, and shopkeepers from Paris. German units held conscripts from Bavarian villages, Prussian military families, and industrial workers from the Ruhr Valley. These men lived according to military schedules that divided each 24-hour period into specific duties. Stand to occurred at dawn, when the entire trench garrison assumed firing positions in anticipation of enemy attack during the visibility transition. Morning inspections followed, with officers examining rifles, ammunition, and equipment, while medical personnel checked for signs of disease or injury. Daylight hours were spent maintaining trench walls, repairing drainage systems, cleaning weapons, and observing enemy positions through periscopes and sniper scopes. Supply operations occurred primarily at night. Carrying parties moved ammunition, food, water, and replacement personnel through communication trenches from rear areas to frontline positions. These nocturnal movements required precise timing and navigation, as wrong turns in the trench maze could lead supply parties into enemy positions or artillery impact zones. Food consisted of tinned meat, hardtack biscuits, jam, tea, or coffee, and occasional fresh bread when supply lines functioned properly. Water arrived in petrol cans that had been cleaned but retained the taste and smell of fuel. British forces received rum rations before dawn stand-to and major operations, while German troops received schnapps or beer when available. Living conditions varied by sector and season, but certain constants defined trench existence. Water accumulated in the bottom of trenches despite drainage efforts, creating mud that could reach knee depth during rain periods. This mixture of water, earth, and organic matter harbored bacteria that caused trench foot, a condition resulting in tissue death and amputation if untreated. Lice infested every uniform and blanket, causing constant itching and spreading typhus among the garrison. The smell represented perhaps the most psychologically challenging aspect of trench warfare. Human waste accumulated in designated areas that could not be cleaned regularly due to enemy observation. Corpses decomposed in no man's land and in sections of trench where burial was impossible. Gas gangrene from infected wounds created distinctive odors that experienced soldiers could identify from significant distances. Poison gas residues lingered in shell craters and low-lying areas, creating chemical stenches that burned the nose and throat. Rats thrived in this environment, feeding on food scraps, stored supplies, and human remains. British soldiers reported rats growing to the size of cats, with some specimens weighing several pounds. These animals showed no fear of humans, often running across sleeping soldiers and chewing through equipment during the night. French forces documented rats consuming leather boots, canvas equipment, and even wooden rifle stocks when other food sources were scarce. Artillery bombardment created a constant backdrop to trench life. Shells arrived without warning, producing explosions that could be felt underground, collapsing trench walls and creating shock waves that disrupted equilibrium and hearing. The psychological effect of continuous bombardment proved as debilitating as the physical destruction. Soldiers developed the ability to identify different types of shells by their sound during flight, distinguishing between high explosive rounds, shrapnel shells, and gas projectiles. Medical officers posted to frontline positions observed alarming behavioral changes among troops who had served extended periods in trenches. Men who had functioned normally during their initial deployment began exhibiting symptoms that military physicians had not encountered in previous conflicts. These manifestations included uncontrollable trembling, inability to sleep, loss of appetite, sudden crying episodes, and a complete inability to function during artillery bombardments. The haunting reality of trench warfare was taking its toll, and the human mind was unraveling under the weight of its horrors. Military discipline in 1916 recognized only two categories of soldiers: those deemed fit for duty and those excused for wounds or illness. The notion that psychological stress could incapacitate a soldier challenged the very foundations of military service, masculine courage, and duty to one's country. Officers steeped in 19th-century military traditions viewed mental breakdown as a mark of cowardice or a lack of character, often leading to court-martial and execution for desertion in the face of the enemy. Yet the numbers were becoming impossible to ignore. Reports flooded in from British forces about soldiers found wandering in rear areas, their minds blank, unable to recall leaving their posts. Some men became cataleptic during bombardments, while others lost the ability to speak or hear, despite showing no physical injuries. French medical units documented similar patterns, and German military hospitals began receiving soldiers whose symptoms defied conventional medical explanations. The technology of 1916 offered no framework for understanding psychological trauma. Military medicine focused on visible wounds, infectious diseases, and other obvious physical ailments. Medical training included no instruction on mental health, and psychiatric treatment remained rudimentary, even in civilian settings. Military physicians grappling with this growing crisis had no diagnostic criteria, no treatment protocols, and no institutional support to address what would later be recognized as psychological injury. The crisis revealed itself through numbers that military statisticians could neither explain nor ignore. By December 1916, British casualty clearing stations behind the Somme reported that 15% of all soldiers evacuated from frontline trenches showed no visible wounds, no signs of gas exposure, and no symptoms of recognized diseases. These men arrived at medical facilities in states of complete psychological collapse, unable to speak, walk, or respond to commands. French military hospitals documented similar patterns with mathematical precision, exposing the scope of the problem. The Val-de-Grâce Military Hospital in Paris admitted 2,000 soldiers between September and December 1916. Their medical files containing identical notations: no physical injuries detected, complete inability to function militarily, symptoms appearing after extended frontline service. German medical records from the same period, captured after the war, revealed comparable statistics among their forces. The symptoms defied every category of military medicine practiced in 1916. Soldiers arrived at casualty clearing stations trembling uncontrollably, their hands shaking so severely they could not hold a cup or button their uniforms. Others had lost the ability to speak, communicating only through gestures or written notes when they could muster enough control to hold a pencil. Some displayed what medical officers termed selective deafness, showing no response to speech or sounds, yet reacting with extreme terror to sudden noises that resembled artillery explosions. Captain Harold Morrison, a medical officer with the Royal Army Medical Corps, documented cases that illustrated the peculiar nature of these breakdowns. Soldiers would arrive at his aid station appearing physically healthy, but completely unable to perform basic military functions. They could not march in formation, could not respond to orders, and exhibited extreme panic reactions when required to handle weapons or equipment. Most disturbingly, these men often retained perfect memory of their civilian lives while displaying complete amnesia about their recent military experiences. The walking cases presented the most challenging diagnostic problems. These soldiers could move, eat, and perform basic personal care, yet they exhibited behaviors that medical training had not prepared officers to address. They would begin crying without apparent provocation, sometimes continuing for hours despite efforts to console them. Others displayed what Morrison described as hypervigilance, constantly scanning their surroundings for threats and reacting with terror to normal hospital sounds like closing doors or dropping equipment. Sleep disturbances affected virtually every soldier evacuated for psychological symptoms. Men who had endured months of military discipline and exhaustion found themselves unable to sleep despite obvious fatigue. When they did manage to sleep, they experienced nightmares so violent that they would wake screaming, often injuring themselves or nearby patients during their panic. Medical orderlies reported that many of these soldiers refused to sleep in enclosed spaces, insisting on remaining near exits even in hospital wards. Physical symptoms accompanied the psychological manifestations in ways that challenged the medical understanding of the time. Soldiers developed what physicians termed functional paralysis, losing the ability to move specific limbs despite having no detectable nerve damage or injury. Others experienced blindness or deafness that could not be attributed to any physical cause. Medical examinations revealed normal eye and ear function, yet these men could not see or hear. The medical establishment's initial response reflected the limitations of 1916 military doctrine. Commanding officers, trained to view mental breakdown as evidence of cowardice, demanded that medical personnel return these soldiers to duty after brief rest periods. Military physicians found themselves caught between medical ethics and military necessity, treating patients whose symptoms they could not comprehend while facing pressure to declare them fit for service. Treatment options remained primitive and often counterproductive. Standard medical protocol required complete bed rest in hospital environments, which often exacerbated symptoms by removing soldiers from the familiar military structure without providing meaningful rehabilitation. Some physicians attempted to shock patients back to normal function through sudden loud noises, cold water immersion, or electric current application, procedures that frequently intensified psychological symptoms rather than alleviating them. The diagnostic terminology of 1916 reflected the medical profession's confusion about these conditions. British physicians used the term shell shock to describe soldiers whose symptoms appeared after artillery bombardment, theorizing that explosive concussion had somehow damaged the brain despite leaving no visible injuries. French medical officers employed the term neurasthenie de guerre, attributing symptoms to nervous exhaustion caused by military stress. German physicians documented Kriegsneurose, or war neurosis, suggesting that military conditions produced temporary psychological dysfunction. Each diagnostic category carried with it a weight of assumptions about causation and treatment that proved increasingly problematic in practice. Shell shock suggested a form of physical brain damage, one that should respond to rest and medical intervention. Yet, as soldiers languished in hospital beds for weeks and even months, many showed no signs of improvement. The term war neurasthenia implied a temporary exhaustion that ought to resolve with proper nutrition and sleep, yet symptoms persisted, regardless of the quality of care provided. Meanwhile, war neurosis hinted at pre-existing psychological frailties, leading to treatment approaches that unfairly blamed the soldiers for their conditions. Military administrators faced mounting challenges, underscored by statistics that became increasingly urgent. The number of soldiers evacuated for psychological reasons was nearing the number evacuated for physical wounds in certain sectors. This alarming trend represented a significant depletion of fighting strength, one that could not be sustained during major operations. Moreover, these evacuations appeared to be on the rise rather than declining as the war dragged on, suggesting that prolonged exposure to the hellish conditions of trench warfare was leading to higher rates of psychological breakdown. As military leaders observed patterns in psychological casualties, the contagion theory began to take hold. Units that had experienced high rates of shell shock seemed to produce additional cases at an alarming rate, as if the condition spread among soldiers through mere observation or suggestion. This led to policies aimed at swiftly separating affected soldiers from their units, coupled with efforts to restrict information about psychological casualties to prevent widespread panic. Medical officers began to document environmental factors correlating with increased rates of psychological breakdown. Sectors plagued by poor drainage, where soldiers lived in constant contact with mud and standing water, reported higher casualty rates. Areas where unburied corpses remained visible produced even more cases than those where burial had been possible. Positions that had endured gas attacks demonstrated elevated psychological casualty rates, even among soldiers who had not been physically harmed by the chemical weapons. The rotation problem further complicated these challenges. Military doctrine called for regular rotation of units between frontline positions and rear areas to maintain fighting effectiveness. However, soldiers evacuated for psychological reasons often exhibited renewed symptoms when returned to frontline duties, regardless of the length of their recovery period. This created a vicious cycle, where the same individuals required repeated evacuations, further depleting unit strength. Communication among medical facilities revealed that the issue extended beyond any single national army or battlefield sector. British physicians corresponded with their French and Canadian counterparts, discovering that identical symptoms were emerging across all Allied forces. Captured German medical documents indicated similar patterns among enemy troops, suggesting that the psychological effects of trench warfare were universal, transcending specific national character or training methods. The military bureaucracy struggled to categorize these casualties for administrative purposes. Soldiers who could not function militarily but displayed no physical injuries did not fit neatly into existing categories for disability, discharge, or pension eligibility. This left a growing population of men who remained technically in military service while being unable to perform their duties, consuming valuable resources without contributing to military effectiveness. Amid this unprecedented crisis, Captain William Henry Rivers emerged as a pivotal figure. Unlike most military physicians whose training focused primarily on surgery and infectious diseases, Rivers held academic appointments at Cambridge University in experimental psychology and anthropology before accepting his military commission in 1916. His pre-war research examined how different cultures responded to stress and trauma, equipping him with theoretical frameworks that many of his medical colleagues lacked. Assigned to Craiglockhart Hospital near Edinburgh, a facility designated for treating officers suffering from nervous disorders, Rivers found himself in a position that reflected military hierarchy rather than medical expertise. Officers required treatment in separate facilities from enlisted men, and Craiglockhart had been converted from a hydropathic spa to cater specifically to this population. Rivers was chosen as chief medical officer primarily because his academic rank made him socially acceptable to treat upper-class patients. The patients arriving at Craiglockhart presented Rivers with clinical material that contradicted every assumption about psychological breakdown and military service. These were not men predisposed to mental weakness or cowardice. His roster included decorated officers who had led successful operations, university graduates who had volunteered for perilous assignments, and career military personnel with records of consistent competence and bravery. Among them was Second Lieutenant Wilfred Owen, who arrived at Craiglockhart in June 1917 after being evacuated from the Somme sector. Owen had served 15 grueling months in frontline positions, participating in multiple operations and earning recognition for his leadership under fire. His medical file noted no physical injuries but documented symptoms that rendered him unable to command his platoon. Severe insomnia, uncontrollable trembling, and panic reactions to sudden sounds. Owen's case challenged the prevailing belief that psychological breakdown reflected personal weakness, as his military record was a testament to his bravery and effectiveness. Captain Siegfried Sassoon presented an even more complex case for traditional military medicine. Having earned the Military Cross for single-handedly capturing German trenches, Sassoon embodied the aggressive courage that military training sought to instill. Yet he arrived at Craiglockhart after publicly condemning the continuation of the war, a behavior that military authorities attributed to psychological breakdown rather than political dissent. Rivers observed that these officers retained their full intellectual capacity despite their psychological symptoms. They could discuss military tactics, analyze strategic situations, and demonstrate a complete understanding of their duties and responsibilities. Their breakdowns seemed specifically tied to their ability to function in combat situations, rather than indicating a general mental deterioration. The treatment environment at Craiglockhart offered Rivers a unique opportunity for in-depth observation, a luxury that frontline medical facilities could not afford. In the chaos of casualty clearing stations, physicians had mere minutes to assess patients before making evacuation decisions. Here, however, Rivers could watch symptom patterns unfold over weeks and even months. This prolonged contact revealed intricate psychological mechanisms that fleeting examinations could never uncover. He quickly realized that his patients exhibited variations in symptoms triggered by environmental cues that seemed unrelated to their current surroundings. The faint sound of distant artillery echoing through the serene Scottish countryside would send them spiraling into panic. The sharp scent of disinfectant, reminiscent of the noxious chemicals used in gas attacks, ignited severe anxiety in men who had never even faced poison gas directly. Even the slightest sudden movement from hospital staff could provoke defensive reactions, as if they were bracing against an unseen enemy. Most strikingly, Rivers documented that these reactions occurred without any conscious control from the patients. Men who desperately wanted to recover and return to their units found themselves powerless against their symptoms. Willpower and discipline were futile against the grip of trauma. This observation directly contradicted the military doctrine that suggested soldiers could simply overcome psychological difficulties through sheer motivation and strength of character. In response, Rivers began to develop treatment methods rooted in his pre-war psychological research rather than conventional military practices. Instead of pressuring patients to suppress their traumatic memories, he encouraged them to articulate their experiences in detail. This approach unveiled a crucial insight. Most psychological breakdowns were linked to specific traumatic events, rather than a gradual decline due to general stress of war. The results of this talking treatment were unexpected and profound. Patients who had previously struggled to discuss their military experiences without succumbing to emotional distress gradually learned to recount their traumatic events without panic. This suggested that their psychological symptoms stemmed from unprocessed memories rather than irreversible brain damage or character flaws. Rivers documented remarkable cases where patients recovered memories that had been entirely absent from their conscious awareness. Soldiers who could not recall how they had been evacuated from the front lines began to piece together detailed sequences of traumatic events. This recovery of memory often preceded improvements in their symptoms, hinting at a vital link between processing memories and psychological healing. Rivers's background in anthropology provided him with cultural insights that many military physicians lacked. His pre-war research had explored how non-European societies confronted psychological trauma, revealing that various cultures had developed specific rituals and practices to help individuals process their experiences. This knowledge led him to question whether the Western military's emphasis on suppressing emotional responses might actually hinder natural psychological healing. He began to challenge the fundamental assumptions about masculine courage and psychological strength that underpinned military training. Rivers observed that those most susceptible to psychological breakdown were often the men who had internalized military values most completely. Soldiers trained to suppress their fear and to function despite danger exhibited the most severe symptoms when their psychological defenses finally crumbled. The officer-patient population at Craig Lockhart presented Rivers with an unusual research opportunity. Unlike enlisted men, whose testimonies could be dismissed as unreliable, officers were seen as credible witnesses, their descriptions of combat experiences deemed trustworthy. Their detailed accounts of trench warfare conditions provided Rivers with invaluable clinical data about the relationship between specific environmental stressors and psychological symptoms. He noted distinct patterns in how different combat experiences produced varying symptom clusters. Soldiers who had endured gas attacks displayed different psychological profiles than those who had been buried under collapsed trenches during artillery bombardments. Men who had led troops into failed operations exhibited distinct symptom patterns compared to those who had witnessed the deaths of close friends. This suggested that psychological breakdown was not a generalized response to war stress, but rather specific reactions to particular traumatic experiences. The social class of Craig Lockhart patients also offered Rivers insights that challenged prevailing theories about psychological breakdown. Military doctrine posited that officers were inherently more resilient than enlisted men due to their superior education and breeding. Yet Rivers observed that officers often displayed more severe psychological symptoms than enlisted men with comparable combat exposure, indicating that social expectations and leadership responsibilities might actually heighten psychological vulnerability. As Rivers began to correspond with other military physicians treating psychological casualties, he shared his observations and treatment methods. This communication revealed that similar patterns were emerging throughout the British medical system. Though many physicians lacked the theoretical framework to interpret their clinical observations effectively. A breakthrough moment arrived in October 1917 during Rivers's treatment of a patient whose case would fundamentally reshape the understanding of psychological trauma. Lieutenant George Morrison had been discovered in a German shell crater, unable to explain how he had crossed no man's land or why he was unscathed despite spending 18 harrowing hours in enemy territory. Morrison's case file revealed no evidence of head injury, poison gas exposure, or physical trauma that could account for his complete amnesia regarding the previous 3 days. While Morrison retained a vivid memory of his life prior to military service and a clear recollection of his arrival in France 6 months earlier, he could not recall anything from a major offensive operation during which his unit had suffered devastating casualties. Traditional military medicine would have attributed his condition to shell shock caused by artillery concussion. Yet Morrison had been found in an area untouched by bombardment. Rivers employed his innovative talking treatment method with Morrison over several weeks, gently coaxing the patient to articulate any memories he could access, without pressuring him to confront the traumatic events directly. As the sessions progressed, Morrison began to recover fragmented memories that gradually unveiled the intricate mechanism behind his psychological breakdown. Each recollection returned in a specific sequence, offering Rivers invaluable insights into the profound effects of trauma on mental function. Morrison first recalled the moments leading up to the offensive operation. Vivid conversations with fellow officers and meticulous preparations for the attack flooded back to him. These memories were sharp and accurate, aligning perfectly with official records of his unit's activities. Next, he unearthed recollections from the initial stages of the operation when his platoon advanced according to plan, blissfully unaware of the impending chaos. Then, during a pivotal session in late October, a critical memory surged forth. Morrison suddenly recalled the harrowing moment when his unit stumbled upon a concealed German machine gun position that unleashed a torrent of fire at close range. In less than 30 seconds, he witnessed 26 men under his command fall, killed or wounded, including his platoon sergeant, a steadfast companion for the past 8 months. The weight of that memory crashed over him like a wave, pulling him into a sea of despair. Rivers observed Morrison's physical reaction as this memory resurfaced. The patient's body betrayed him, exhibiting symptoms identical to those documented during acute combat stress: a racing heartbeat, beads of sweat forming on his brow, uncontrollable trembling, and labored breathing. Yet, these symptoms erupted in the sterile calm of a hospital room, far removed from any real threat. This stark contrast illustrated a profound truth. Psychological symptoms could be triggered solely by memory, independent of any external danger. More importantly, Rivers noted that Morrison's amnesia was selective and purposeful. His mind had retained memories that were bearable, while effectively blocking access to those too painful to confront. This revelation suggested that psychological breakdown was not merely random mental deterioration, rather, it was a specific defense mechanism designed to shield individuals from experiences they were ill-equipped to handle. Intrigued, Rivers began testing this theory with other patients, employing careful questioning techniques to probe the depths of their memory gaps. He discovered a striking pattern. Nearly all psychological casualties exhibited similar selective amnesia. Soldiers could recall routine activities, pleasant experiences, and even successful military operations. Yet they were unable to access memories of traumatic events, failed missions, or the deaths of comrades. The implications of this discovery extended far beyond individual treatment. Rivers realized that the human mind possessed intrinsic mechanisms for managing overwhelming experiences. Psychological breakdown occurred not from a lack of courage or character, but rather when these mechanisms were overwhelmed by the intensity of stress. This understanding reframed the narrative surrounding psychological casualties, positioning them as the result of normal mental processes responding to abnormal levels of trauma. With this newfound knowledge, Rivers developed a systematic approach to help patients recover traumatic memories in controlled environments. He gradually exposed them to manageable portions of their past while providing the psychological support necessary to integrate these experiences into their broader memory framework. The results were nothing short of revolutionary. Patients previously deemed permanently disabled began to show remarkable improvement once they accessed and processed their traumatic memories. Men who had been unable to function in military roles for months found renewed strength and capability after completing Rivers's treatment program. Rivers meticulously documented the physiological changes accompanying these psychological improvements. Patients' sleep patterns began to normalize, allowing them to process traumatic memories without succumbing to nightmares. Physical symptoms like uncontrollable trembling diminished as they consciously accessed the memories causing their unconscious stress. Most importantly, they regained the ability to differentiate between past traumas and present realities, significantly reducing inappropriate fear responses to benign environmental triggers. The success of Rivers's approach caught the attention of other military physicians grappling with psychological casualties. Dr. Arthur Hurst at the SEAL Hain Hospital adopted similar treatment methods for enlisted men, discovering that the principles Rivers established applied universally, regardless of social class or military rank. Captain Louis Yeeland at the National Hospital for the Paralyzed and Epileptic crafted variations of the talking treatment for patients suffering from functional paralysis and sensory disorders. Rivers's correspondence with French military physicians revealed that similar breakthroughs were occurring independently among Allied forces. Dr. André Fribourg-Blanc at the Neurological Center in Tours noted that soldiers recovered from psychological symptoms more swiftly when encouraged to discuss their traumatic experiences rather than suppressing them. Dr. Gustave Roussy at the Salpêtrière Hospital in Paris documented cases where memory recovery preceded functional improvement, further validating Rivers's observations regarding the connection between trauma processing and symptom resolution. The timing of these discoveries coincided with strategic developments that rendered them immediately significant. The German Spring Offensive of 1918 would impose unprecedented demands on Allied forces, necessitating the maximum utilization of all available personnel. Military commanders, who had previously dismissed psychological casualties as mere malingering or cowardice, now faced the urgent need to reintegrate these men into effective service as swiftly as possible. In response, Rivers began training other medical officers in his treatment methods, developing standardized protocols that could be implemented at casualty clearing stations and field hospitals closer to the front lines. This marked a fundamental shift from evacuation-based treatment to forward treatment, ensuring that psychological casualties remained within the military system rather than being relegated to rear-area hospitals. However, Rivers encountered institutional resistance to his methods, reflecting deeper cultural conflicts surrounding masculinity, courage, and mental strength. Traditional military culture equated emotional expression with weakness and perceived psychological vulnerability as a failure of character. Rivers's treatment required patients to confront and articulate their emotional responses to traumatic events, directly challenging entrenched military values that prioritized emotional suppression and stoic endurance. Yet, the practical results were undeniable. Units that embraced Rivers's forward treatment protocols experienced a remarkable surge in the rates of return to duty among psychological casualties. More importantly, soldiers who received early intervention exhibited lower rates of subsequent psychological breakdown, indicating that proper trauma processing acted as a shield against future stress reactions. The systematic implementation of psychological treatment protocols throughout the British military in 1918 yielded measurable changes that transcended individual patient outcomes. Military statisticians reported a staggering 40% reduction in long-term evacuations for psychological casualties among units employing Rivers's methods, in stark contrast to those relying on traditional rest and evacuation procedures. The Royal Army Medical Corps established specialized neurosis centers at strategic locations behind each major front, staffed by physicians trained in Rivers's techniques. These facilities treated psychological casualties within days of symptom onset, rather than weeks or months later, effectively preventing the entrenchment of symptoms that complicated later treatment. By September 1918, 12 such centers were operational between the English Channel and Switzerland, processing approximately 800 patients each month. French military medicine took note of these results, adopting similar approaches after comparing their casualty statistics with those of the British. The Service de Neurologie de Guerre, established under Dr. Clovis Vincent, implemented treatment protocols that emphasized early intervention and trauma processing over extended hospitalization. French physicians adapted Rivers's techniques to align with cultural differences in emotional expression and military hierarchy, yet they retained the core principle of helping soldiers confront and process traumatic memories instead of suppressing them. The expansion of psychological treatment necessitated training hundreds of medical personnel in concepts that had been absent from medical education prior to 1917. Military physicians, whose education had primarily focused on surgery and infectious diseases, now needed to grasp psychological mechanisms, trauma responses, and therapeutic communication techniques. The War Office established intensive training programs at military medical schools, creating a curriculum that would influence medical education long after the war's end. Treatment protocols developed for military use began to influence civilian medical practice, as physicians recognized similar symptom patterns among industrial accident victims, railway workers who had endured crashes, and others who had suffered traumatic experiences outside the military context. The notion that psychological symptoms could stem from overwhelming experiences rather than character weakness challenged fundamental assumptions about mental illness and psychiatric treatment. The documentation requirements for psychological casualties produced unprecedented clinical data on trauma responses and recovery patterns. Military physicians meticulously recorded detailed case histories, symptom progressions, treatment responses, and outcome measurements for thousands of patients. This extensive database laid the groundwork for systematic studies of psychological trauma that would continue throughout the 20th century. Geographic variations in treatment implementation highlighted the significance of military culture and command attitudes in shaping patient outcomes. Units led by officers who recognized psychological casualties as legitimate medical conditions reported higher recovery rates than those where commanders viewed such cases as disciplinary issues. This underscored the profound impact of institutional support on both the incidence and treatment of psychological symptoms. The technological limitations of 1918 influenced treatment development in ways that would prove historically significant. Without pharmaceutical interventions for psychological symptoms, treatment relied entirely on therapeutic communication and environmental modification. This emphasis on talking therapy and social support established precedents for psychological treatment that persisted long after medications became available. Communication between frontline medical facilities and rear area hospitals improved coordination of care, preventing counterproductive treatment conflicts. Soldiers who received initial trauma processing at forward positions demonstrated better responses to subsequent treatment at base hospitals, while those evacuated immediately without processing often required more intensive interventions later. The distinction between officer and enlisted treatment facilities gradually diminished as medical personnel recognized that psychological trauma transcended social class and military rank. While separate facilities continued to exist due to military hierarchy, treatment methods became standardized across social boundaries. This represented a significant shift in military medicine's understanding of psychological vulnerability and resilience. International cooperation in the development of psychological treatment occurred despite the wartime context, facilitated by the exchange of medical literature, prisoner-of-war medical reports, and post-armistice information sharing. German military physicians independently developed their own trauma treatment methods, utilizing different theoretical frameworks but achieving similar practical results. This convergent evolution suggested that effective psychological treatment principles were universal rather than culturally specific. The return-to-duty rates for soldiers treated with trauma processing methods soared to over 90% in some units, compared to less than 60% for traditional rest and evacuation treatment. However, these statistics revealed critical limitations in measuring treatment effectiveness. Many soldiers who returned to duty continued to grapple with psychological symptoms that affected their performance and quality of life, even if they could function adequately for military purposes. Long-term follow-up studies, conducted through pension application reviews and veteran organization records, indicated that soldiers who received trauma processing treatment exhibited lower rates of chronic psychological disability compared to those who had not undergone such intervention. This finding suggested that effective treatment during military service provided a protective barrier against the long-term psychological consequences of combat exposure. The administrative burden of implementing psychological treatment protocols led to a significant expansion of military medical bureaucracy. Record-keeping systems underwent essential modifications to track psychological casualties separately from physical wounds. Treatment facilities required different staffing and equipment, and personnel policies needed adjustment to accommodate soldiers undergoing psychological treatment. These institutional changes would resonate within military medical organizations long after the echoes of war faded. Training programs for military physicians in psychological treatment techniques sparked interest from civilian medical educators, who recognized the broader applications of these trauma treatment methods. Several universities established post-war research programs to study military medical developments, paving the way for academic departments focused on psychological trauma. This expansion would deepen the understanding of mental health for decades to come. The economic implications of effective psychological treatment soon became apparent through military efficiency calculations. Soldiers successfully treated for psychological trauma represented preserved investments in training, maintained unit cohesion, and avoided the costs associated with recruiting and training replacement personnel. Military accountants calculated that trauma treatment programs paid for themselves through retained personnel alone, not even factoring in the humanitarian benefits. Quality control measures for the implementation of psychological treatment revealed significant variations in effectiveness based on practitioner skill, institutional support, and patient characteristics. Some medical officers achieved consistently excellent results, while others showed minimal improvement in patient outcomes, despite using identical protocols. This disparity underscored the critical importance of practitioner selection and training in therapeutic interventions. The integration of psychological treatment into standard military medical practice established precedents that would influence military medicine policy in subsequent conflicts. The treatment protocols developed during World War I provided frameworks for addressing psychological casualties in later wars, though their implementation varied significantly based on military culture, resource availability, and institutional priorities. The lasting impact of systematic psychological trauma treatment extended far beyond the immediate military context, establishing principles that would shape medicine, psychology, and societal understanding of human responses to extreme stress throughout the 20th century and beyond. The recognition that ordinary individuals could experience psychological breakdown under overwhelming stress marked a fundamental shift in the understanding of mental health and human resilience. Veterans returning to civilian society after 1918 carried with them first-hand knowledge of psychological trauma that challenged existing social assumptions about mental illness and personal strength. Communities that had sent young men to war, expecting them to return unchanged, discovered that combat experience had profound psychological effects, even among those who bore no visible wounds. This awareness gradually influenced public understanding of the intricate relationship between experience and mental health. Medical education began to incorporate concepts of psychological trauma into curricula, though implementation varied significantly between institutions and remained limited for several decades. The physicians who had developed trauma treatment techniques during military service became advocates for expanded psychological training in civilian medical education. Yet, they faced resistance from traditional medical institutions that viewed psychological treatment as outside the scope of proper medical practice. The documentation produced during wartime psychological treatment programs laid the groundwork for systematic research into trauma responses that would continue throughout the century. Research institutions established archives of clinical records, treatment protocols, and outcome measurements, enabling long-term studies of trauma effects and recovery patterns. These invaluable databases would enhance the understanding of psychological trauma mechanisms and facilitate the development of more effective treatments. Industrial applications of trauma treatment principles emerged as physicians recognized similar psychological patterns among workers who had experienced accidents, disasters, or occupational stress. The idea that traumatic experiences required processing rather than suppression began to influence workplace safety programs, accident response protocols, and disability compensation systems. Industries with high accident rates started implementing psychological support programs modeled on military treatment methods. Legal systems gradually adapted to recognize psychological trauma as legitimate grounds for compensation and disability claims, although this process required decades of advocacy and education. The precedent established by military pension systems that compensated psychological casualties influenced civilian legal frameworks for addressing trauma-related disability in workplace accident cases, criminal justice proceedings, and civil litigation. Despite medical advances in understanding and treatment, the social stigma associated with psychological breakdown remained powerful. Veterans who had received successful treatment for combat trauma often concealed their military medical history to avoid discrimination in employment, housing, and social relationships. This stigmatization limited the dissemination of trauma treatment knowledge and prevented many civilians from seeking psychological help when they needed it most. International humanitarian organizations began incorporating psychological support into disaster response programs, recognizing that natural disasters, refugee displacement, and civilian exposure to warfare produced trauma symptoms akin to those observed in military contexts. The Red Cross, Salvation Army, and various religious relief organizations developed volunteer training programs that included basic psychological first aid techniques. Academic psychology established specialized research areas focused on trauma responses, treatment methods, and long-term recovery patterns. Universities created psychology departments with faculty positions dedicated to trauma research, leading to an expanded theoretical understanding of memory, stress responses, and therapeutic intervention. This academic foundation would prove crucial for developing more sophisticated treatment approaches in the decades that followed. The influence of World War I trauma treatment rippled through literature, art, and cultural expression as veterans and medical personnel began to share their harrowing experiences through creative works. The poignant poems of Wilfred Owen, the heartfelt memoirs of military physicians, and the raw artistic expressions of soldiers opened a window into the psychological trauma that affected countless lives. These narratives educated the public, reaching audiences far beyond the confines of medical and military communities. They preserved a vital awareness of trauma's effects, ensuring that future generations would not forget the scars left by war. In the aftermath of the war, military institutions across various countries developed distinct approaches to preventing and treating psychological casualties, each shaped by their interpretation of the lessons learned. Some organizations leaned towards psychological screening, aiming to exclude individuals deemed vulnerable, while others prioritized resilience building through rigorous training and fostering unit cohesion. These differing strategies would be rigorously tested in subsequent conflicts, yielding mixed results that would shape future military practices. The economic ramifications of untreated psychological trauma soon became glaringly evident. Veteran disability systems strained under the weight of unaddressed mental health issues, while lost productivity and social service utilization painted a stark picture of the costs incurred. Societies that invested in trauma treatment infrastructure found themselves facing lower long-term costs for veteran care. In stark contrast to those relying solely on disability compensation without therapeutic intervention. These economic analyses began to influence government policies regarding military medical care and veteran benefits, highlighting the necessity of a more compassionate approach. As medical technology advanced, research into the physiological mechanisms of psychological trauma progressed significantly. Yet, the foundational principles established during World War I remained relevant. The understanding that trauma symptoms stemmed from normal stress responses rather than character weaknesses laid the groundwork for neuroscientific inquiries into trauma's effects on brain function and the development of pharmacological treatments. The globalization of trauma treatment knowledge unfolded gradually, facilitated by medical literature, international conferences, and professional exchange programs. Techniques initially developed for military trauma found applicability among civilian populations exposed to violence, disasters, and other traumatic experiences, regardless of cultural backgrounds. This universality suggested that trauma responses were fundamental human psychological mechanisms, transcending cultural specificity. The legacy of World War I's psychological treatment programs continues to shape contemporary approaches to trauma intervention. Modern methods now incorporate technological advances and a broader theoretical understanding. Yet, the core principle remains unchanged. Traumatic experiences require processing rather than suppression. This recognition of trauma's physiological effects has deepened our understanding of recovery mechanisms, paving the way for more effective interventions. Today, modern military organizations have established sophisticated psychological support systems, drawing on a century of trauma treatment research and practical experience. These systems emphasize prevention through training, early intervention via forward treatment, and comprehensive long-term care for service members grappling with combat stress. The effectiveness of these programs underscores the enduring value of systematic approaches to psychological trauma. The story of how ordinary medical officers and common soldiers forged effective treatments for psychological trauma serves as a testament to the potential for innovative solutions to arise from practical necessity rather than theoretical research. The collaboration between physicians and patients to understand trauma responses birthed knowledge that would benefit millions throughout the century, even if their contributions often went unrecognized by the very institutions they served. The transformation of military medicine's understanding of psychological casualties from a disciplinary issue to a legitimate medical condition stands as one of the most significant advances in military healthcare. This shift has implications that extend far beyond battlefield medicine. Recognizing that human psychological capacity has limits and that exceeding those limits produces predictable symptoms requiring specific treatment, challenged long-held assumptions about courage, character, and mental strength that had shaped military culture for centuries. If you found this exploration of how ordinary people discovered extraordinary solutions under extreme circumstances compelling, consider subscribing to our channel. We invite you to share where you are watching from in the comments below. Your engagement helps us continue to shed light on these important narratives.